I'm sure a lot of you have seen people mess with getting action swap with a Deku stick, lighting it, and then having some weird things happen. So you can get some pretty random sound effects to play doing this. Also, your Deku stick becomes incredibly long, and you can do silly things like this. The purpose of this video is just to explain why these things happen on a technical level, and hopefully give you some insight into one of the weirder glitches in the Zelda 64 games. First, we need to understand how the game chooses a sound when we draw a ranged weapon. I've got an address on screen, and you can see right now it's 0. If I draw a bow, it goes to -1, and then up to 1 when I shoot. And then similarly for hookshot, it starts out as -3, and goes up to 3 when I shoot. And you can see that this does actually control the sound that plays when I shoot my ranged weapon. For instance, if I change it to 3 while I have bow in hand, bow is going to sound like hookshot. So this is the address that the game uses to control the sound that plays when you draw a ranged weapon. It's also important to note that when I'm just standing around with a ranged weapon in hand, this address is set to a negative value. And if I try to make it positive, for instance, I'll try to set it to 5, the game just immediately makes it negative. Now we have to somehow relate that to a burning Deku stick. So when we light a Deku stick on fire, presumably there's some sort of address that's going to control the timer for the Deku stick burning down. So now we need to find that address. So I wonder where we could... Yep, there it is. So hopefully this starts to make a little more sense. We have an address that controls what sound plays when we draw a ranged weapon. We have an address that controls the timer when we burn a Deku stick, and we see that they're one and the same. And this timer gets set to 200 when we are standing in a torch, and as soon as we move out of the torch, it starts counting down. And as it gets down to 0, what's going to happen is that the length of the Deku stick is going to shrink. And then as soon as it hits 0, we'll just put the stick away. And under normal gameplay circumstances, the fact that these two things are controlled by the same address would never matter, because a Deku stick is not a ranged weapon, and you can't set a ranged weapon on fire. But of course, Action Swap exactly mixes those two things. Right? We get Action Swap with a Deku stick, we put it in hand. Now the game thinks that we have a ranged weapon in hand. And remember that earlier, when we tried to set ranged weapon draw sound to a positive value, the game immediately made it negative. So we're going to do just that. The torch is going to set this to positive 200, and then as soon as we move out of it, it becomes negative 200. But because we have a non-zero stick timer, the game is going to count down the stick timer. It's just going to keep subtracting from that. Normally, this is never supposed to be able to go below 0. But what does happen when it goes below 0 is that that effect where the Deku stick was shrinking, well, it just keeps on shrinking. But if you keep on shrinking past 0 length, then that turns into negative shrinking, which turns into growing in the opposite direction. So that's why our stick is so long in the negative direction. You can see that it just has to do with the timer. So now we have some understanding that it's the length of the Deku stick, alternatively the timer of the burning Deku stick, that's going to control what sounds play when we do Action Swap. So we do Action Swap, we light the Deku stick, it's got some negative length, and then when we shoot, because again the game is treating it as a ranged weapon, it's going to make that value positive. So we load up an arrow, and we go to shoot, and the game crashes. So somehow it's taken that 423 up there and has tried to play some sort of sound, and it's crashed. So the next thing we want to do is understand exactly what happens, what it does with that value, and how it comes up with a sound, and even possibly something that would crash the game. So now we're having a look at the game's RAM, and what I have brought up here is a table of 4 half words, and these are the sound instructions that the game uses to determine what happens when you draw a ranged weapon. So this one right here is the sound that plays when you draw the bow. This one right here is the sound that plays when you arm the hookshot. And the game just starts from here and adds the offset in that ranged weapon shooting sound address that I had earlier. So remember, bow was 1, hookshot was 3, and it's not meant to go any higher than that in the context of looking up sounds. But of course, when we did action swap with the Deku stick timer allowed us to get pretty much whatever value we wanted um, for the offset here. And that means that not only can we use these as our possible shooting sounds, but we can use the next 32,000 or so half words after that as well. And so basically anything down here, and I'd have to scroll down a while to show all of them, anything here, by choosing the right stick value, we can use as a shooting sound, or at least try to play as a shooting sound. So for instance, in that clip just before, where I got action swap and shot a Deku stick, I had a Deku stick length of 423 when I shot, and that corresponds to looking up this here as our shooting sound. And it just happens that when this is interpreted as a sound, it is not a valid one, and so it's going to crash the game. So, like I said, we have literally over 32,000 different possible things to choose from. So we can probably find some fun things in here. So I'm going to switch games just to show off a few things that we can do with this. Everything that I've said so far applies equally well to both MM and OOT. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to get action swap, and I'm going to manipulate it such that I have a very specific stick length so that I can play a blue warp sound. So the sounds that you can play from this action swap, sometimes they're, quick sound effects that just happen. Sometimes they're things that loop and don't stop, and this is one of those cases. So now we're hearing a blue warp. But of course, if we have a pretend blue warp, we should at least pretend to walk into the pretend blue warp. So the question is, can we pretend to walk into this blue warp? And luckily, since documentation about all these sound effect things is very good in OOT, we can figure out a way to do just that. So here we are on the Cloud Modding OOT wiki, and here there is documentation of the way that sound effects work in this game. And you can see that they are half-word or 2-byte instructions, just like we were looking at before in the RAM. And the first digit controls which bank of sounds the sound is pulled from. The second digit controls how the sound plays, basically. Sometimes it controls effects or length of the sound. And then the third and fourth digits are what determine exactly which sound plays. So if we want to step into a blue warp, we're going to have to go to the environment bank, and we can find here is the blue warp. So 2.5 in the environment bank is the sound of a blue warp, which we already have playing, and 2.6 in the environment bank is the sound for entering a blue warp. So now we're back to looking at the RAM. This is the sound table for OOT, and because we just looked at the way that sound effect commands are structured in OOT, we can understand how these work. So for instance, this one right here, it starts with a 1. So according to that page that we were just on, that puts it in the item bank of sounds. And it ends with 0.7, and that's going to give it the bow drawing sound. So this is the bow sound. It's in the same place that it was in MM. It's the second item in the table. And then there's slingshot and hookshot as well, both also in the item bank of sounds. And so if we want to step into this blue warp, then what we're going to have to do is find something that's in the environment bank. So it has to start with a 2. It has to end with a 2-6 because that was the entering the blue warp sound. And then the second digit has to be an even number greater than or equal to 4. So that's what we need to find. So in order to do that, I'm going to start by just searching for the 2-6 because we know that one's locked in place, and then we can just try and find one that has the right two things in front of it. All right, so I'm going to find values of 2-6. So here's one. It just has 0 in front of it, so that's not going to be helpful. All right, here's another one. Again, 0's in front. Here's another one, but I said the second digit has to be something even, which is not the case here, so that one won't work. Here's another one with 0's, 0's, 0's. So we're just going to keep on looking. Now, this one looks good, but we see that if we switch back to viewing things as 2 bytes, this 2-6 was the first half of the instruction, not the second half. So that's not going to help. So we'll keep on going. 2-0 is not going to work either. All right, so we've had to come down a little ways, but eventually we find something that's of the form 2, even number greater than or equal to 4, 2-6. So we expect that this will play the sound of us walking into a blue warp. And this is still within range. We're down a fair ways from where we started, but we're still within range of Deku stick action swap. So in order to figure out what stick length we need to get here, we take the address that this is at, which is 3B0F1A. We subtract from that the address of the start of the sound table, and then divide that by 2. And that tells us that we require a stick length of 12,690. Okay, so we're going to have to wait a little bit to get there. All right, I've let this run until we're just about at the desired stick length of 12,690. So let's see what happens when we get there. Just like we wanted. I've got one more application of this that I'd like to discuss, and this is a very interesting glitch discovered by Turkenheimer, where on the English and PAL versions of Majora's Mask, if you try to force the game to execute certain sound commands, and these seem to be commands that are in the system bank and have sound IDs that are out of normal range, what will happen is the sound will just cut out entirely in the game. And this is such a complete cutout that changing areas doesn't bring it back, watching various cutscenes doesn't bring it back, even owl saving to the file select menu and changing your file doesn't bring it back. So I've arranged a video here that will show off the glitch. This is on BizHawk, but it does work on BizHawk. And here I'm manipulating to get a very specific stick length, and you can see, or you can hear, that the audio has cut out completely. There is audio playing from BizHawk right now, but the game is just not making any sound. And one of the side effects is that if you try and play a song on your ocarina, this is what will happen. And that's just a soft lock. In this clip, I'm recreating the glitch on N64. In order to do this, you just have to figure out how many frames you need to wait after leaving the torch, and then you can convert that to seconds, and then using a timer, it's not too hard to get. Alright, so once again, you can hear all the audio has cut out, and we've got the no sound glitch active. Now, one thing that's interesting about this is that it seems that this glitch crashes the Virtual Console and GameCube versions, whereas on N64 and BizHawk, it works just fine. Also of note is that in Turkenheimer's original video, when they performed the glitch, and this video was on PAL N64, it seemed that their game sped up from a typical PAL frame rate to more of an NTSC frame rate. As you can see, I did not experience any significant increase in frame rate when I performed this glitch on N64, but I don't have a PAL N64, so I can't test what happens on that version. So, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video and have fun doing weird things with Action Swap.